You'll find treasures more valuable than gold, digging in the Word.
We're doing a series. We're going through 1 Corinthians 14 at the moment, and we've just explained, I've just gone over the fact that prophecy is, the one who prophesies is greater than the one who speaks in tongues, because he is doing something that builds up the church. And he's serving others, and Jesus said that he that is the least among you shall be the greatest among you shall be the servant of all. So he's serving the entire congregation. The person who speaks in tongues is only edifying himself, unless he interpret. So he that prophesies is greater than he that speaks in tongues, unless he interpret the speaker in tongues, so that the church may be edified. So tongues plus interpretation edifies the church, and prophecy edifies the church. Now, Paul makes an argument in verse 6, but now, brethren, if I come to you speaking with tongues, what shall I profit you, unless I speak to you either by revelation or by knowledge or by prophesying or by teaching? Now here Paul, Paul could be saying, if I come speaking in tongues and I also have a revelation, knowledge, prophecy, and teaching, then I can edify you. But if I only come speaking in tongues, I don't edify you. Or perhaps Paul is saying that if I come to you speaking in tongues and the interpretation of the tongue is revelation, knowledge, prophesying, or teaching, then he would be able to edify the speakers. In any case, speaking in tongues by itself does not profit the people that Paul would be coming to, the Corinthians. Verse 7, even things without life, whether flute or harp, since they make a sound, unless they make a distinction in the sounds, how will it be known? How will it be known what is piped or played? Okay, so if you got somebody going on the trombone or going on the violin, unless they're making some kind of playing different notes, you're not going to know what the tune is. So I've known some people who've tried to play musical instruments like that, and it's not pretty, and it doesn't mean anything to anyone. You have to have some melody, you have to have some notes that are recognizable in order for the harp to make any sense, for people to appreciate it and to know what you're playing. And in verse 8, for if the trumpet makes an uncertain sound, who will prepare himself for battle? Back then they used trumpets for war. They would use trumpets to make signals. Now if the trumpet made a march signal, it had to be clear. You don't want to have a signal that sounded kind of like march forward and kind of like retreat. That would not be a good signal to send to the soldiers. It needs to be a very certain sound. So likewise you, unless you utter by the tongue, this is verse 9, unless you utter by the tongue words easily understood, how will it be known what is spoken? For you will be speaking into the air. Okay, so if you come in and you're speaking in tongues and there's no interpretation and nobody knows what you're saying, it's not going to help. It's like playing a trumpet that with notes that people don't know or don't recognize, playing an uncertain sound on a trumpet. In verse 10, there are, it may be, so many kinds of languages in the world, and none of them is without significance. Verse 11, therefore, if I do not know the meaning of the language, I shall be a foreigner to him who speaks, and he will be a foreigner to me. I like the King James, which says barbarian. And the word barbarian in English comes from actually a Greek word, presumably that Greek word comes from the idea that foreigners were always saying bar, 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 bar. They didn't understand Greek. They were speaking their own language, and the Greeks perceived it as bar, 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 bar. Somebody who didn't speak Greek was a barbarian, bar, 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 because that's all he knew how to say. It was some gibberish, bar, bar, bar. That was the Greek. Perhaps it reflected the Greek attitude towards other languages. But if someone comes to me speaking in Mandarin Chinese, and I don't know Mandarin Chinese, it's not going to do any good at all. It would be quite frustrating trying to communicate with someone in a language that I do not understand at all. So this is the point Paul's making. He moves from musical instruments to something quite a bit closer to the issue of speaking in tongues. If no one understands the message in tongues, it's not going to profit them. Now let's look at verse 12. Even so you, since you are zealous for spiritual gifts, let it be for the edification of the church that you seek to excel. In verse 13, therefore, let him who speaks in a tongue pray that he may interpret. Okay, this is a very good, clear argument here. The Corinthians excelled after spiritual gifts, and Paul said, it's good that they were zealous after spiritual gifts, and Paul was praising them. It's good that you're zealous after spiritual gifts. Now be zealous to edify the church. So if you're seeking just to be able to speak in tongues in the meeting, and you go in the meeting and you all speak in tongues, it's not going to edify anybody. What you need to do is seek to edify the church. That's what the gifts are there for, is to edify and build up the church. It helps accomplish God's purpose, because by building up the church, the parts of the body edify each other in love until we come into a perfect man that builds up the bride of Christ, so that the bride will be mature and suitable to be a bride for Christ, the husband. So this is something in the heart of God to prepare that bride for Christ. So by edifying and building up one another, we're accomplishing God's purpose to give a beautiful, wonderful bride to his son by building up the bride for the spiritual gifts. Okay, so we need to be zealous after that. In verse 13, we learn something about speaking in tongues. Let him who speaks in a tongue pray that he may interpret. Okay, so if speaking in tongues were a spiritual gift that gave you a natural ability to understand Lithuanian or Spanish when you had not studied it, this verse would not make much sense. If you know your native language, for example, say your native language is English, and God gives you a supernatural gift to speak the Dani language on the island of Papua New Guinea. If God gives you a supernatural gift like that, and you understand both languages with your natural mind because of the gift that you've received, then it makes sense that you would be able to interpret what you're saying. I speak 2 languages fluently, and I'm able to interpret from one language to another. Now sometimes I'm not a native speaker in that other language, so I speak Indonesian. I'm not a native speaker. My interpretation may be a little off. Every once in a while you kind of get stuck. There are certain words that are hard to translate from one language to another because the concepts aren't really there. But it's possible to translate. But here Paul says to pray that you may interpret. And what Paul will clarify and make it a bit clearer, that the speaker in tongues does not understand what he's saying unless there's interpretation. In verse 14, for if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my understanding is unfruitful. What is the conclusion then? I will pray with the spirit, and I will also pray with the understanding. I will sing with the spirit, and I will also sing with the understanding. Okay, so if somebody prays in a tongue, their understanding is unfruitful. They pray in a tongue, but their mind does not know what they're saying. The spirit prays. As Paul says, in the spirit he speaks mysteries. If I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays. Okay? So, but my understanding doesn't. My spirit prays. Now some people will say, oh, that's bad. You shouldn't pray unless your understanding understands. Paul doesn't say that. He says in verse 15, what is the conclusion then? I will pray with the spirit, and I will also pray with the understanding. I will sing with the spirit, and I will also sing with the understanding. Okay, now there's 2 ways to interpret this. One would be that Paul says, I will pray in tongues sometimes, and sometimes I'll pray with the understanding. That may be what he means. He could also possibly be talking about interpreting his prayer. I'll pray with the tongues, and then I'll interpret it in the kind of language I understand. Either situation would fulfill what this verse says. So there are people who pray in tongues who are able to interpret what they pray. And in the Pentecostal revival of the early turn of the century, there's an account I've read at Azusa Street where the content of an interpretation of tongues was a prayer to Jesus. So these type of things do occur. Okay, so in verse 16, otherwise, if you bless with the Spirit, how will he who occupies the place of the uninformed say, Amen, at your giving of thanks, since he does not understand what you say? Now, if you pray in tongues, you bless with the Spirit. Blessing here, you're saying some kind of blessing prayer. Or you're pronouncing a blessing. Other people cannot say amen to your speaking in tongues because they don't understand. The people that don't understand what you're saying, or perhaps people who are not familiar with speaking in tongues, cannot say amen to it. They don't know what you said. Maybe you've just cursed everybody. Maybe, or they, it's just, there's no way for them to understand what you're saying, so they can't say amen to it. So apparently, Paul is wanting the people in the congregation to say prayers in the common language so that everyone can say amen. And this is also a little glimpse, if you see later in the chapter, early church meetings were very, you could say, interactive or mutually participatory, mutually edifying. Everybody has different gifts, and they use them in the church. Many different people teach. Many different people prophesy. This is all evident in the passage. So the prayer is done not just from one person at the front, but whoever prays needs to pray so that other people can understand, and so that the other people can say amen. We'll continue with this teaching on another video. Thank you very much for joining in to Digging in the Word.
You'll find treasures more valuable than gold, digging in the Word.